so good morning. First of all, thank you very much for Mr. Gray.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very delighted to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for Fronteiras do Pensamento, who brought Mr. Gray to Brazil and to Rio, and Edward for having arranged this meeting. My name is Anastasia. No. We're here today to interview Mr. Gray. Just kidding. Okay, Mr. Gray, I think we might describe him as a public philosopher, at least in the last few years of his career, because he jumped the walls of academia and started writing for people like us, for the likes of us, although he had a very consistent and long career in the university. He taught at Oxford. He was a professor at Yale, at Harvard, and your last position was at the London School of Economics, right?
That's right.
As a professor of European thought.
That's correct.
Very good. But he has a very long list of books, many of them published in Brazil, like Cachorros de Palha, Straw Dogs, The Silence of Animals, that has not been translated yet, and the latest, which is the Soul of the Marionette.
And also the Immortalization Commission has been translated.
Has been translated.
In Brazil.
Also, there is in Brazil a large collection of his essays, which is called Gray's Anatomy, Anatomia de John Gray, Missa Negra, Black Mass,
yes,
and 2 or 3 others. So there's a lot of his books around so that you can get familiar with his thought. I think I would like to begin with a famous quotation by Sigmund Freud, who said that he wanted to apply the third greatest blow to our self-esteem. Freud once said that the first blow had been applied by Copernic, who showed that the Earth was not in the center of the universe. So we were not in the center of the universe. Then Darwin came and said that man was an animal like all the others. And finally came Freud and said that we were not masters in our own house, because the unconscious was always playing against us. Is it correct to say that you were in the same business of beating our self-esteem, and that the job of beating our self-esteem was not completed when Freud destroyed our illusion about being masters in our own house?
That's a very excellent question, and I'd say Freud did complete the destruction, but Freud has not been understood or accepted. He's a very unpopular thinker nowadays. And if you ask why is Freud unpopular, there are various reasons. One reason is that he's not scientific. People now think that the social sciences or human sciences should really be sciences, and by that they mean that they should copy the quantitative methods of natural sciences. And of course, Freud's writings are not scientific in that way. He himself described some of his theories as myths. In a famous letter exchange he had with Einstein in the 1930s about war, in which Einstein said that war could be abolished if political organization was altered and the causes of war were removed. And Freud said he didn't think war could be altogether abolished because some of the causes of war were in conflicts which were internal to the human animal. They would remain. At that time, Freud said, well, of course, some of my theories, like my theory of the death instinct, Thanatos, is a myth. It's a kind of myth. So I treat Freud, I think of Freud in a different way, but I think of him as it were, the last great, and possibly one of the very greatest Enlightenment thinkers. Because what he did was, he developed a type of thinking in which the inability of humans to understand themselves is, so to speak, part of what makes them human. That's what I suppose he meant by saying that the unconscious is there all the time. So contrary to Descartes, contrary to much of Western tradition, he didn't identify the mind, the life of the mind, with consciousness. Most of the life of the mind was not conscious. The way I interpret that is to say that it's part of being human, according to Freud, that we don't understand why we do what we do, or why we live in the way that we do. We enact things in the world. We have relationships, we have projects, we develop theories and philosophies, but in all of that we hardly understand ourselves at all. So in some ways I would say that what I'm trying to do is not to go further than Freud, not to inflict a fourth blow, but actually simply to try and make it clearer what Freud was doing. Because one of the key things he held about psychoanalysis is that it was interminable. That's to say, he didn't think that psychoanalysis could cure the soul of modern human beings. Jung thought that, his rival. Jung thought that, and Jung flirted with various movements, including even Nazism, which he thought could cure the modern soul. Freud was very suspicious of any office of cure, and so am I. He thought that office of cures of the modern soul, of the sickness of the modern soul, pretty well always made it worse. And I think that too. And I suppose the way that comes out in my work, and this is one of the things which is most difficult in my work, is that I am not really interested in solutions. I think talk of solutions at the moment in the world is either stupidity or bad faith. There aren't solutions for most contemporary problems, or if there are, contemporary humanity won't accept the solutions, so they won't work anyway. And that's a very hard to digest view, because it means we must live with insoluble difficulties. And that, I think, was Freud's view. Remember one of the things he wrote, I think to one of his patients, he said, I can't offer anything like, psychoanalysis can't offer anything like happiness, but perhaps we can turn the hysterical misery of neurosis into the normal suffering of everyday life. And I like that. So to me, he's a modern Stoic, and a Stoic without any of the metaphysical beliefs of the ancient Stoics. And in some ways, although I've only written about Freud in the last few years, I think I'm really trying to develop, to make clearer what he thought, although, of course, he wasn't always fully consistent.
But some people would say that you're trying to apply a fourth blow to our self-esteem.
Some people would say that, yes.
Yeah, because you have been criticizing liberalism and all other arrangements for the politics created since the Enlightenment. So you described Freud as the last Enlightenment thinker, and you've been trying to, I don't know if demolish is the right word, this inheritance of the Enlightenment. Isn't this a fourth blow, in a sense?
In a sense it is, because what replaced the sense of self-esteem that Copernicus and Darwin and Freud destroyed, and particularly the first two, Copernicus and Darwin, the self-esteem of humankind wasn't in fact destroyed, it mutated into something different. So one of the sort of interesting ways is that Darwin's theories, the Darwinian theory, which I think is the closest approximation to the truth that we have, wasn't accepted by most of those who absorbed it as destroying or deflating human self-esteem. They turned it into another form of self-esteem. They said, well, in that case, what it's really about is that it shows humanity to be the end result, the top of the evolutionary ladder, which wasn't Darwin's intention. In Darwin's autobiography, short book, a very interesting book, he says natural selection blows like the wind. It doesn't go anywhere. On the other hand, on the last page of The Origins of Species, he does himself slip into this language of hierarchy of evolution. He says when he looks out, he sees soil in the ground, he sees worms, and from worms come higher forms of life, and flowers, and eventually vertebrates and primates, and then humans. And he even uses the word progress to describe it. So there's been a tremendous confusion in modern thought between evolution and ethical and political progress, which I've tried to dissolve. So it is true that what I'm trying to do is to prick the self-esteem which has grown up after Freud and after Darwin and after Copernicus, which wasn't really deflated. The message of these thinkers was never really accepted. Now, I guess one of the criticisms of my writings is, well, you prick it, you deflate the Enlightenment, you deflate, but you don't replace it by anything else. You don't give a positive vision. Everyone says that. Just as everyone says that I'm tremendously pessimistic. For example, when I published in 1989 my attack on Fukuyama in October 1989, just after he published his famous essay, The End of History, in August, I said, history hasn't ended, it's going on as usual. And everyone responded, then we're all doomed. Well, why should we be all doomed if history's going on as normal? It shows, in a sense, the depth of modern delusion. Still, a great many people, including powerful thinkers, important politicians, powerful bureaucrats in the European Union and elsewhere, think that the future is going to be completely different from the past in ethical and political terms. But the kinds of crashes, follies, disasters that happened before are not going to happen in future, which of course guarantees them to happen in future. It means that normal history will contain, because normal history is the history of folly, very largely. So I think at the moment, just to make a topical observation, what is happening in Europe is the history of folly. The folly of the European project, which began as a peaceful, benign project after the Second World War, began in a fine way. It was really about peace. Mutated, maybe after the end of the Cold War, into a hubristic project, a project of hubris, and then into the European currency, which became too large and accepted members that should never have joined. And now these rather vapid bureaucrats who operate, who manage the European currency, are protecting it as their supreme goal is to protect it. Even if that means destroying the life chances of a whole generation of young people in Greece and Spain and Portugal, even if it means inflicting depression, economic depression, psychological depression as well, on these countries greater than the depression between the two world wars, higher levels of unemployment, even if it means that they're hanging on to this project. And I think the result will be, I don't know when, because I can't predict that, no one can, the result will be that the project will break up, will fragment, will collapse. And that will be a very big news, because if the Eurozone disintegrates, it's an enormous entity, trillions and trillions and trillions. That will be an enormous, but I think it will happen. Not necessarily now, but not necessarily as a result of the Greek crisis, though it may. But it will happen over the next 7
Why?
Because the project of saving the currency has triggered political revolts that can't be contained. In Greece and in Spain, Podemos, in Italy, and even in France, where the revolt, unfortunately, is mainly on the right. That's to say, National Front. What they left out, these European projectors, is that we live in an age of democracy, and people will not put up indefinitely or forever with a complete eclipse, a complete overshadowing of their future life chances. They'll reach a point of desperation and anger when they rebel. And they may rebel through a Syriza, which, although I'm not a Marxist and I'm not even on the left, I have a lot of sympathy for Syriza, even though I don't accept their philosophy. Or, more darkly, they'll rebel through Golden Dawn or the National Front. These parties well, either didn't hardly exist. At Golden Dawn got about 3% of the vote before this crisis. Now it's 25% of the vote. National Front's been around for a long time. It's been getting steadily stronger. This form of the European project has enhanced and inflamed these radical political movements. So it's bound to break down because essentially it's impossible to condemn half of Europe, or a third of Europe, let's say, to a more or less permanent depression. They won't accept. But that is, of course, completely characteristic of the modern, of many aspects of the modern project, because Iraq was a similar project, the Iraq War, importing through regime change attack of liberal democracy, which couldn't possibly work there.
You made a distinction between the Golden Dawn
Yes.
and the Liberal Front, which are
And the National Front.
and the National Front, excuse me, which are
Not a sharp distinction, they overlap, but there is a distinction.
yeah, right-its movements, and the Syriza or the Podemos, which are from the left.
Yes.
If you renounce the idea that there is a project, there is some goal that can be attained,
Yeah.
how can you do these distinctions between left and right and what is good?
What is good and what is bad? Well, you see, I'm not... one of the thinkers I mentioned in my new book, Soul of the Marionette, is mostly well known as a poet, Giacomo Leopardi. And Leopardi believed in the constancy of human nature, as I do. That's to say that human beings don't change much. Their knowledge changes a lot, grows a lot, their technologies change, but human beings don't change much. And therefore, I'm not an ethical relativist. That's to say, I believe that there are some goods and some evils that are good and bad for all human beings. No one benefits by being tortured. No one benefits by being raped. No one benefits by being persecuted for their religion or their sexuality. So I think there are some, and by the way, if you ask why I think this and how I came to this view, you might be rather shocked, but I came to this view many years ago, or was confirmed in me when I was living in America and I went to a number of zoos. I went to a whole variety of different zoos, mostly in California. And some were good zoos and others were bad zoos. And what I found is that in the bad zoos, the animals all looked the same. That's to say, they paced up and down if they were tigers. They were very nervous. They had short hair. They didn't breathe very much. If you looked at the gorillas are not used in their natural habitat to live on concrete. They don't like living on concrete. They've never lived on concrete. They're not programmed by evolution to live on concrete. So if they're put on concrete for their whole lives, they don't live long. They hardly ever breathe. And they die. So what I've sort of found, if you like, is that in the case of non-human animals, there are, so to speak, almost objective aspects to well-being, which are the same. Now in the good zoos, and California had a couple of good zoos, one in particular, the animals look completely different. They had better conditions to live in, they lived a long time, they reproduced, they had flowing hair. So why should humans be different? There are certain conditions of a kind of good and bad life, which I think are just almost, you might say, almost like moral facts. Where moral dilemmas come in is that the goods and the evils of human life, although in my mind, to my view, they might be semi-objective, often conflict with each other. So we can have what we think of as maybe freedom, but less security. We can have peace, but not justice. We can get rid of a tyranny, but sometimes if you get rid of a tyranny, what you have instead is anarchy. So it's not that. So actually, the objectivity of ethics doesn't give you a way of solving moral dilemmas. The objectivity of ethics, given that there's a plurality of goods and a plurality of bads, create moral dilemmas, which are almost insoluble. Perhaps if I have time, I can mention one that Isaiah Berlin, who I learned a lot from, told me about, from direct personal experience in the Second World War in Britain. During the Second World War in Britain, a leading minister suddenly, in the government, the wartime government, suddenly appeared in his office. And in his office were roughly 20 workers. And he said, I'm going to do something now which is very unjust. One of the most unjust things I've ever done, but I believe to be right. I'm going to fire you all. And the reason is that one of you, we don't know who, is leaking information to the enemy. And as a result of that information which is being leaked to the enemy, we've narrowed it to this office, but we can't go to it. One of you, brave men and brave women, who are being parachuted in behind enemy lines, are being tortured, are being killed, are being murdered, and the war's being put in danger. I'm going to fire you all. And this is a very hard thing to do because the people who are fired didn't just lose that job, they were never employed. They had a black mark in there. Even though 19 of them out of 20 were completely innocent. Only one of them was guilty. And no one was never found out. So 19 people suffered a terrible and permanent and irrevocable injustice. Never repaid. And yet he thought, the minister, that that judgment was the right judgment. Now, for this minister and for Berlin and for me, as it were, what frames the dilemma are, so to speak, semi-objective goods and bads. There's the terrible evil that would have followed if the Nazis had won the war. What would have followed? Countless people would have been killed in Britain. The Holocaust would have gone on to further in Europe and extended to Turkey and Egypt. Even more people would have died when the Nazis went on to attack the Soviet Union than did die, and the Soviet Union was about, some people say about 27 million died in the course of that conflict. It would have all been incomparably worse. And that's semi-objective. But in order to prevent that, an injustice had to be committed. This was a small injustice, only 19 people suffered it. Other great injustices maybe had to be committed, like saturation bombing of Dresden and Hamburg and various other terrible things that had to be done, or at least it was thought at the time had to be done. So what these objective goods and bads frame are, so to speak, insoluble dilemmas. And now this brings me back to your point. What's my positive message after the negative? The positive message is to try and bring moral thinking back to reality. And the reality is, even sometimes in small ways in our everyday life, sometimes we don't always, thank God, live in the middle of terrible wars of natural survival. But we all have to make ethical choices of various kinds, choices of how to live. And very often, those choices are choices between evils, or they're choices between goods where we don't know what to do. And there's no actual simple rational calculus for that. So in a way, what I'm really trying to do is only not to provide an answer or a set of answers, because actually I don't believe answers always exist, or solutions, but to bring us back to the reality. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a disciple of Kierkegaard, but he did write, he had a very good metaphor for the philosophy of his time, which was mainly dominated by Hegel. He said, philosophers are like people who live at the foot of a mountain, in a hovel, a dirty, untidy, scruffy, half-broken down little house. And every day they go to the top of the mountain and build a beautiful, magnificent structure, some kind of marvelous pillars, and they go back and live in the house. That's what philosophy is like. And I think he's right. It's better to try and clean up the mess a little bit down at the bottom by being a little more clear, a little more about what we're doing, and a little closer to reality. So that's all I'm trying to do.
You mentioned the Stoics at the beginning of the talk, and you're described as a sceptic here behind you.
Yes. Yes.
Are you comfortable with this description?
And
what is your link with the old tradition of philosophy?
Well, a great influence on me has always been Michel de Montaigne, who of course was a disciple, if he was a disciple of anyone, of Sextus Empiricus, the Greek skeptic, and ultimately of Pyrrho, the founder of Greek skepticism. And a certain kind of radical skepticism goes all the way through Michel de Montaigne's work and through my work. But of course, Montaigne also cited the Stoics a lot. I've been influenced by them too. Not so much Marcus Aurelius, but there's more Seneca in his letters, Seneca the dramatist and so on. Because the Stoics, of course, they had a metaphysics. This is where Freud comes back. They had a kind of metaphysics that I don't accept. Neither did Freud. But the idea that most of the context of our lives we can't control. It's very unpopular again nowadays. Very unpopular. The idea is we must be authors of our lives. Well, how can we be authors of our lives when we don't choose when to be born? When we don't choose our first language or our parents? If you accept Freud's theory, our characters are moulded in childhood, in the first 2 or 3 years of our lives. We don't choose them. Our very identities, the things we suffer from, and also the things we enjoy, are, so to speak, impressed on us by our earliest experiences, which we don't choose. Now, maybe you could say that out of that we can develop some kind of condition of choice, but we can't really alter our lives in the way that modern liberal theory maintains that we do. So a Stoic, I think, accepts that. And yesterday when I gave the talk I framed, I think, what might be the Stoic way of thinking about these matters. I think a Stoic, as I understand it, is someone who wants who believes we can live well without believing that the world is going to improve. And that's what the Stoics did. I mean, they didn't think that the world was getting better and better, or even that it could get better and better. They didn't believe that. They thought that history ran in cycles. But in those cycles, one could do good. So if you happen to be an emperor, Marcus Aurelius, you should perform the duties of an emperor. It doesn't mean you should accept every aspect of your life. Freud is interesting in this respect, by the way, which is that I think Freud's Stoicism took the form that one could defy fate, and even should, but not overcome it. Do any of you know the anecdote, I believe it to be true, of what Freud did when he was finally forced to leave Austria by the Nazis? Do any of you know this story? I think it's a good story because it's sort of one of Freud's jokes. And he was a reckless joker at times, and this was really reckless. When he was forced to leave by the Nazis in 1938, he spent the last year of his life in London. He was forced to sign a document at the frontier, leaving. And the document said that he had to sign a document that said, "I have been treated with extreme fairness by the Gestapo." So he signed it, and underneath he wrote in his own hand, "I would recommend the Gestapo to anyone." Now, if you think that was a very dangerous thing to do, what he was relying on was that the Gestapo had no sense of humour. Yes, well, maybe all these Jews are not as bad as we think they can see. They can see that we're really, very decent chaps in our way. And it's a sad codex to that story. He had 2 sisters, old ladies, who were living in Vienna, and they didn't leave. And the reason they didn't leave is they thought that being very old, they hardly ever left the apartments they lived in. They never had any public, nothing would happen to them. They both perished in the camps. They were arrested, taken away. He never found out because that wasn't known till 1945 what had happened to him, and he died in 1939. But I think that's a sort of example of an attitude I admire. He defied fate. He even defied it for his pleasures. When he was in London, he was dying of cancer, cancer of the mouth. But he refused to stop smoking his cigars. He even invented a device because he couldn't get the cigars into his mouth anymore. He had a kind of wooden peg inserted so he could stick them in. His view was, "I'm not giving up my cigars just because I'm dying of cancer. Why should I?" And I admire that. So he thought that fate could sometimes, his fate was to be born in a time of European barbarism. That was his fate. But he couldn't alter that fate. But he couldn't overcome it, but he could defy it. And that, I think, is a sort of, is a kind of an ethical stance that I identify with. One can be a fatalist without being passive. To think that there is such a thing as fate in life, that's to say, something that can't be changed, doesn't mean you have to just lie down and accept it. You can defy it, even if you can't fundamentally alter it.
The old philosophers, they thought of philosophy as a way of reaching the good life.
Yes.
So philosophy, if we might apply this word, was a sort of self-help.
Yes.
Do you do what you do as a sort of self-help?
Well,
or self-troubling? What would it
it's a very good question. The answer is yes and no. On the yes side, I share with Isaiah Berlin, who in part of his life, of course, was Russian, and what in Russia philosophy was supposed to be about, actually, was much more how to live. In other words, what it became certainly in the 20th century and when I studied philosophy, even when Berlin studied it in the 1930s, it was concerned with a variety of technical questions, basically surrounding issues of logic and philosophy of mind and metaphysics and epistemology. That's what it was kind of about. And professional academic philosophers would kind of blush or shrink from the idea that they were talking about how to live. Especially, I'm talking about especially English speaking. So well, maybe the French do that, but let them get on with it. But I think the core of what philosophy really was to do with how to live. And in fact, now I almost wouldn't call myself a philosopher anymore, because philosophy has become, you mentioned at the start, kindly, you generously said that, like, right now, and I'm read now by people outside of the academic community, I don't really like the philosophy which is purely intra-academic. I mean, what is a philosopher now? A philosopher is a professor who writes for other professors. But only 20, 30 years ago, that wasn't true. Berlin was read widely, whether or not you agree with it. Karl Popper was read widely by people outside of... and I think that's, in a sense, if philosophy has a purpose, or a telos in Greek sense, it would be to speak to general anxieties, general problems, general issues, general worries, and that are going on. And the way I think of it is that what I do, and I think of myself primarily now as a writer, not as a philosopher, but one who writes about issues that used to be considered philosophical, is to try and open up thought a little bit by considering some of the categories and assumptions that we have. So one of the categories and assumptions that is widespread, that unless there is progress, at least as a possibility in ethics and politics, unless there is a kind of cumulative advance, so that what you gain, you keep, and you get advanced. I mean, this is what people say. They say, against my work, they say, well, we're not utopians, we don't believe in perfection, but what we believe in slow, gradual improvement, that's what we believe in. Well, I'd say slow, gradual improvement is more utopian almost than anything else, because what very often happens is that what has been gained is suddenly lost. That happened in Greece, after all. The Greeks were doing pretty well. They were doing moderately well. They weren't the richest country, but they weren't poor. They weren't as poor as they are now. They've lost enormously in the last 5 years. And whatever happens now in Greece, whatever happens, they lost for the next 20 years, probably. My view is that if they leave the euro, they'll probably rebound more quickly. There's some possibility of hope in that. If they stay in, there's no possibility of hope. But they're going to go through very hard times, whatever happens. And even a country which was suffering from despotism, like Iran, is in a much worse condition now with ISIL than it was before the regime change. And that will be true for the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years probably, because the state has collapsed. It will take a long, long time to rebuild it, if it can be rebuilt in some new form. So what is gained is lost. And that is a kind of normal pattern in human life. And so the function that I try to perform is to say that despite that, if you go back in history to a point at which people like Montaigne, like Seneca, like Marcus Aurelius, like the great skeptics, didn't believe in cumulative progress, they all nonetheless thought deeply about how to live well, how to live a good life. I mean, did no one live a good life before about 1750? Were people lying around in despair until 1750? Saying, I just can't see any progress. I'm not getting up today. I just people say that by the way. They say, well, if I believed what you did, John, I wouldn't get up in the morning. I say, well, don't. Just stay in bed. Stay in bed. At least until you find a better reason to get up. It's childish because most people who've ever lived, including most philosophers and most religions, nearly all, have not believed in this modern myth until quite recently. And the fact that people cling so desperately to it shows me that they're anxious and depressed. I mean, much of modern thought is a therapeutic defense against depression. Whereas if you take a different view, a view more like Montaigne, more like Seneca, more like these other thinkers and religious teachers, if you take this other view, there's no reason to be depressed. You can live well, or at least strive to live well, without believing any of this nonsense, without deceiving yourself into believing that the future is going to be completely different from the past. But there are going to be no stock market crashes, there are going to be no new terrorist cults. I wrote a little book on Al-Qaeda in which I said that if Al-Qaeda was defeated or became less important, probably something else would develop similar, which might be even worse. People were terribly pessimistic. People said, oh, horrible, I can't believe that. Well, it has in fact happened. And if ISIL is defeated or destroyed, very likely something else would develop, either a religious form of terrorism or a non-religious form of terrorism. We've had strange cults in Japan and elsewhere which have not been rooted in traditional religions but have been kind of new apocalyptic cults. It's sort of built into our modern way of life and even our pre-modern way of life that there are such cults. We just have to expect them. The world can't be made safe from them.
I have an old book of you here, which is called Post-Liberalism. There's a nice picture of him with a beard here.
in an earlier life.
Yes.
An earlier incarnation.
And you ended this book saying, our task is to preserve the practice of liberty that is transmitted to us by the inherited institutions of civil society. So you appeared to be saying that, yes, we progressed. We came a long way and we have something that is worth fighting for. And then after you wrote this book, you seem to have abandoned this idea that there were institutions of a civil society, as you described here, that were worth, not worth fighting for, but that should be defended at any cost.
No, I don't think I did abandon
You
that.
You didn't?
No, I think exactly the same as I thought there. What we should abandon are the theories and the ideologies that surround them, particularly the ideology that grew up. That was written, I think, before the end of the 1980s. And what happened towards the end of the 1980s is that various ideologies developed, not only Fukuyama but others, which said that our institutions, our practices were spreading throughout the world. And if they weren't spreading, we should make them spread. Bomb the rest of the world into submission. Or, as now being attempted in Europe, cut off the banks. If we make the Greeks bow to their knees because we cut off all the banks, they will surrender. And they'll adopt a sort of neoliberal version of market reform and so on. Now that's not the only form of these ideas. You needn't be a neoliberal to believe these. You can be a different kinds of liberal. I think these ideas of the evolutionary spread of Western practices and civil society to the rest of the world are just delusions. It's not in fact happening. When people thought it would happen in Russia, it didn't happen. People then thought, I once addressed a whole room of bankers, and I said, how many of you believe, this was about 10 years ago, that China will become a modern Western market economy? Every single hand went up. We all believe that. Well, of course, they were in China trying to make money, that's why they believed that. But I said, well, my message to you is that that's very, very unlikely. And the reason it's very unlikely is that although China can make enormous advances and has done, hundreds of millions of people are better off, standard of living has gone up for hundreds of millions of people. Although that's the case, a point will come when, in order to survive, the regime will turn away from liberalization and reimpose certain types of repression. It won't go back to Mao. Not going to happen. But it will, and I think that very change is happening now in China. There is now a move to repression. Communist Party is being re-strengthened. The communist departments are existing, are being revived in all major institutions, including universities, with the army to keep an eye on people. And the reason is that There's been a tremendous period of growth and improvement. It's kind of faltering now, and now we have a stock market crash after a property market crash. So where does this new Chinese middle class, if it sees its wealth, what does it do? It becomes potentially dead. So you have repression. So what there is not a kind of evolution, but a series of human decisions. The decision to abandon Mao and move to a policy of economic reform lasted about 30 years. They're not going to go back to Mao, but they may go on to something else. Putin hasn't gone back to the former Soviet Union, whatever people say, he hasn't. But it's certainly not a Western liberal society. So what I recommend, and I've never changed my view about this, I think our institutions, they're flawed, they're imperfect, they have many terrible things. There was discrimination against women before that, there was slavery, there would be all kinds of flaws and evils. But those flawed institutions are worth protecting. After all, if you compare what exists in Brazil or in Britain or in Italy or in France or in Portugal, Spain, with what exists in ISIL or even in Russia or even in China, there are many, many dangers and difficulties, but the extreme threats to human well-being that exist in the parts of the world are reduced. So these institutions deserve to be protected. The question is, can we protect them without the illusions that are associated with them, without the ideologies? I hope so, because the ideologies have actually harmed them. The ideologies by invading countries, which promoting these forms of democracy. What happened? The most recent is the one which my own country was one of the two that were most guilty. The most recent disaster is actually in Libya. We toppled a dictator who was in de facto a pretty awful dictator, but what was the result? Within about 6 months, it's complete and total anarchy. No government at all. ISIL is there, crossing over, they're near Europe, they're crossing into Italy, they're crossing into Europe. That's a direct result of France and Britain, more than the Americans, who actually weren't very keen on doing it, had to be sort of persuaded to support it. That was David Cameron and Sarkozy. Who did it. And that was so in fact the ideologies have damaged the institutions. So that's what actually I was suggesting at the end of in that passage that you read out. I think we should stick to the institution. Now, is it progress? Well, these institutions have developed. They've developed partly, I think, through chance. But if it is chance, we're lucky to have them. And we should stick to them. And by the way, I should mention nothing. In order to promote these institutions throughout the world, we shouldn't damage them. We damage our own institutions by, for example, sanctioning torture. We damage them by sanctioning kidnapping, secret rendition, because they are breaches of the rule of law. People vanished. Nobody knowing where they went to, they've never seen again. Some of them ended up in Guantanamo, where some of them still are. We damaged our own institutions by this policy. It's not to say, by the way, that I think that the threat of terrorism is unreal. It isn't unreal. It is real. You only have to look at Charlie Hebdo and other events to see that it's completely real now. So we can't just assume that it will go away if we don't. It won't go away, whatever the West now does. If the West withdrew from the Middle East, withdrew completely, I think it would still be there, it would still be a threat. But I think hubristic theories, in fact, have really damaged the institutions that we should cherish. And I'm sort of fond of these institutions because they protect human beings from each other. And in particular, they protect people with less power, to some extent. It doesn't work perfectly. They protect people with less power from people with more power. And that's a great achievement. Why is it that so many Chinese business people are buying property in London? Why? There's a huge boom in parts of London, but why are they doing this? The reason is the property won't be stolen by the Mayor of London. It won't suddenly be confiscated. It's safe once they buy it. The reason is there is a rule of law. It's not perfect, very partial, it has lots of gaps in it, lots of difficulties, lots of etc. But it's completely different from China, where you could be the country's richest human being and still be suddenly arrested and sentenced to death by another part of the machine, which somehow has ended in a rivalry with you. So nothing is ever secure. However rich you are in China, so a large part of the elite now has moved out, just attempted to move out resources into other countries where they would be better off. So these are valuable institutions, and I think we should hang on to them as much as we can, and we should even defend them if there's no hope. Let me give you a different example. I mean, go back to maybe an earlier example. In 1940 in Britain, it looked as if the position was hopeless. Now, I wasn't born, I was born in 1948. But if I had been around an adult in 1940, I hope the view, I believe the view I would have taken, which is that we should have gone on fighting, even if defeat was certain.
Pardon?
Even if defeat was certain. Certain. Why? Because the consequences of surrender would be worse than defeat. If we'd surrendered, which many people wanted, by the way, the majority of British politicians wanted it. In the City of London, which is the financial institution, they wanted it. Most of the Conservative Party wanted it. Even Labour, which didn't want to, many of them were pacifists. Pretty well all the major institutions and people in Britain wanted a negotiated peace. If we had a negotiated peace in 1940, we would have essentially surrendered to Hitler's main demands. We would have ended up by having policies imposed on us like those in Europe. Eventually, we would have lost our freedoms. People would have vanished in the middle of the night, and so on and so forth. It would have been worse than losing. So I reject this sort of view which says, well, unless we think we can win in the long run, we're not going to fight. I take a more activist or aggressive view, if you like, which is to say there are some circumstances where it's better to fight and lose than not to fight. Better to fight even if you know you're going to lose than it is. So even if by doing what it's done, Syriza ends up by worse off, at least worse off than before, or blows up the Eurozone, could happen. I still think actually that what they were doing was, though I don't accept any of their ideology there, various forms of Marxism, radical leftism, I still think that they were making an assertion of, if you like, human dignity against policies which were degrading that human, and which furthermore didn't even work and would never work. If they had agreed to the latest cuts, the economy would have contracted further. There would have been more sorrow, more misery, with going on forever. I don't think one should accept that anyone should accept that. One should resist it, even if one should resist it, even if you can't really improve it.
Very well. So you're not so dangerous as some people say you are.
So more dangerous. Some people say it's even more dangerous.
I think that we should give the opportunity to people
Yeah.
to ask a couple of questions. I think that we have, what?
15 minutes?
Yeah, okay. So
All right.
if anybody wants to ask Mr. Gray anything.
I hope you're not all persuaded.
In English.
Okay. So Europe is experiencing some troubles with immigrant waves. And how you see this moment? How you see Europe in years, or in 40 years,
In how many years?
in 20 years or 40 years, for the next generation?
I think the Eurozone will be gone in 20 years, for sure. Because, in other words, the euro currency in its present form will be gone. It will have broken up. Even if it doesn't break up now because of Europe, because of Greece, it probably will, but it may not. There may still be some kind of last minute fudge or it doesn't look like that from what we hear from Germany and Finland and similar countries. They're being very tough, and the Dutch and so on. They said we shouldn't give any more deals. But maybe there will be. Maybe it'll hang on for a few more years. But it's essentially unstructured. So it'll break down. And I welcome that breakdown, but I think it has great risks, such a breakdown. Because, unfortunately, when an absurd project is launched, it hardly ever gets dismantled intelligently. I can't think of any example in history when that's actually happened. Maybe you can, but if you have a project which turns out not to work, to be disastrous. By the way, this was predicted by lots of people. There were economists and others who predicted that the euro would have these results. Not economists, some of the left, some of the right said it will never work, can't possibly work. But they never break down they never dismantle carefully and intelligently, because the people who run them identify themselves with the project. Not just their reputations and their incomes and their pensions, though they must be important, but even the meaning of their lives. There are lots of people, I know lots of people who don't benefit materially from the euro in Britain, for whom the European project of transcending nationalism adds to the meaning of their life. When I tell them, I say, well, it hasn't transcended nationalism, it's made nationalism worse. Brought out the worst types of nationalism in the Golden Dawn in Hungary. Terrible forms of illiberal have come out. In France, as I say, which is probably the biggest important, the National Front is much stronger than it used to be five years ago. Taking over lots of local governments, by the way, in France. It's already banning people it doesn't like because of their religions or their backgrounds from serving in local orchestras and that kind of thing, municipal orchestras. All doing all these kinds of things. Terrible. Worse than it was 5 or 10 years ago. They can't accept it. Why can't they accept it? They don't have any arguments really. They just look unhappy and angry. And the reason is, it's part of the meaning in their lives to think that this movement is going on. So it'll simply break down. So I think in 20 years there won't be any euro. Problems of immigration. Well, of course, here again, they're partly problems created by the Eurozone and partly problems created by Western policies. There would be flows of immigrants from Afghanistan, from Syria, and from Iraq anyway. But of course Iraq was destroyed by Western policy. The war in Syria has been prolonged by Western policy. The flows from Libya are greatly increased by Western policy, which has destroyed the state. But these are facts now. It can't be undone. You can't put it back together again. That's one of the problems. It's very easy to destroy a state. Very difficult to create one. Say, well, all right, we destroyed it. We just have another one. How long will it take? I've met people that say, well, it might take as long as, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. Well, how long has it taken to create the Brazilian state? How long did it take to create the British state? How long did it take to create the French state? Or take the biggest example of all, the American state. It took a terrible civil war in the 1860s. People don't talk about it much in America, but it was one of the most brutal and violent and terrible modern wars. Concentration camps, mass killings, huge battles in which tens or hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Their property set alight and burned. Now, it may have been a just war, it may have been a right war, it may have ended slavery, but it was a terrible war. It was only after that war that America became a modern state. No modern state has come about in 3 or 4 or 5 years, ever. And yet people talk about it. Well, we've got to build institutions in you, you've got to recreate. How long will that take? Maybe 5 generations, not 5 years. And it won't be done by the West because nobody trusts the West. So who will it be done by? It could be done, God forbid, by ISIL. That would be the worst kind of result of all, you might say. So I don't see the future of Europe. I think Europe, and I don't say this just because I'm in Brazil. A few years ago, I was in Barcelona and met a group of young people who, for me, are people under 40, by the way. And many of them said, I said, well, tell me what you're doing. There were about 20 or 30 of them. And most of them were planning to emigrate. Now, that might have been the group I was talking to. I'm not thinking that most of Spanish youth is not. So I said, well, where are you going? Many of them were planning to go to Brazil. So they were learning Spanish, but they were learning Portuguese. Some were planning to go to Germany. Some were thinking of Australia. A lot of them were planning to emigrate, and they said, what would you do? I said, well, look, I'm much older than you are, and I can't give any general answer because the answer has to be specific to an individual's circumstances. Do you have a family that you want to stay with after? Do you have a loved one you can't leave? Do you have money or skills, or the possibility of acquiring skills, whereby you could do better in another state? They're all very individual issues. It can't be a kind of general answer. But I would say this, that if I were in your position without, or do you want to stay here and fight politically? I said, you have to take that decision. But if you're sick, what I would not do is wait for this situation to clear up. If you do that, you'll wait another 20 years, and instead of being 30, you'll be 50. And nothing will have cleared up in the meantime. Because whatever happens, this mess in Europe is going to last a long time. Even if the euro collapses as it will collapse, that will be, even if Greece, as I think will be better off, reinvents the drachma or something, it'll be a huge upheaval. Because they're not in a position of Argentina. Argentina kept its currency. It was just tied to the dollar. It kept their old currency. They have to reinvent a new currency. Greece has fewer natural resources. Argentina has vast natural resources. 80% of the Greek economy is imports. If they cut the currency and leave the euro, the currency will drop by maybe half. So all the imports will be twice as expensive. Now it's true, other things will happen. Tourists, especially from Britain, will flood in. Everything will be half the price. So they'll get, part of their economy will recover, but it'll be a terrible sort of cataclysmic shock. And there could even be social unrest, upheaval, the banks, especially if the Europeans deliberately produce this result. It's possible, I hope it doesn't happen, that the Europeans will deliberately destroy the Greek banks. If they pull the plug in the next few days, that's what will happen. The whole system will go down. So no one will be able to make any payments. It'll be a cash economy with no cash. I mean, Greece has become a cash economy. What's a cash economy without no cash? A non-economy. It'd be a terrible situation. Remember, you've got Golden Dawn in the mix. It's not going to be good. So I'm not optimistic about Europe. It's been a very civilized place to live in for a while after the Second World War, and still is in some parts of Europe, Poland, maybe some of the Scandinavian countries. But I don't think the future of the world. I think the European experiment in civilization will sort of go on. Parts of it will do well, and I wouldn't be unhappy if my own country, Britain, became more detached from the Eurozone. I think it will anyway. It'll probably be a good thing. But I think it's not somewhere where one can look forward with a tremendous amount of hope. Europe. Whereas, although I know in Brazil the economy is weaker than it was and there are various problems, I think other parts of the world have a better chance than Europe does. The problems of Europe now are not fully solvable. I mean, it's not going to sink. It's not going to become. There's not going to be a civil war in Europe. There's not going to be a catastrophe. There isn't going to be Nazism in the traditional way, because, for one thing, by the way, there aren't mass political parties anymore. Great political parties, these kind of great terrible movements of the 30s, I think, are not going to have many other terrible things, but not those. So it's not going to be a catastrophe. But it's going to be a period of long-term confusion, difficulty, currencies coming and going, governments coming and going, attacks on gay people, attacks on. Won't be pleasant most of the time. But I'm too old to leave, so I'll stay.
Well, guys, I think that we've run out of time. So I would like to thank Mr. Gray very much for his presence. And
thank you for your question. It's a very good question. It's very interesting.
It was very interesting.
Very difficult.
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's what they should be.
But I hope you had fun. I think it was very interesting. Thank you for you all for coming. And Fronteiras do Pensamento for bringing him to Brazil. And until next time.